Hello, I'm Orna NiChionna, and it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about the National Trust and its climate change decisions and issues. Chapter 0 exists because you're all aware of the urgency of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions quickly. By 2050, we have to be at net zero globally. But in fact, by 2030, in just 8 years, we need to see emissions drop by 45% globally. And at present, they're still rising. Only 50% of FTSE 100 companies have a net zero plan. Those of you who are chairs and NEDs can help change that by raising the subject, by asking for plans, by scrutinising those plans and monitoring progress. Chapter 0 has more than 1,800 members already and aims to equip you with more knowledge about a complicated subject and therefore more confidence to address it, so that you can help your own organisations transform from talking vaguely about the subject to setting ambitious targets and developing plans to get there. It does so through tailored events and workshops. Hearing the stories of other organisations brings things to life, and that's why we're here today. I hope you find the session thought-provoking and that you sign up to Chapter 0 if you've not already done so. I shall start today by taking 5 minutes to remind you all of the complexity of the National Trust. And I should add, sadly, my 9-year term as trustee and deputy chair, and in fact acting chair for the past several months, ended 2 weeks ago. But I shall still say we when I talk about the Trust, partly because I haven't weaned myself off that, but actually because the National Trust and everything in it belongs to the nation, to all of us. Julene is going to turn the slides for me. So next slide, please, Julene. Here is the National Trust's carbon footprint recently. You can see that the 4 largest categories are tenanted farms, goods and services purchases, the let estate, and then in the green on the right-hand corner, the investments, the endowment. Next slide, please. I don't expect you to read it. This is just proof that we have a plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2030. And there are a lot of different categories of emissions there, and all of them are moving downwards. I'm going to now take the 5 minutes to explain why we had that profile that I showed you in that first carbon emissions chart. The Trust was founded by these 3 radical visionaries in 1895. They were focused on acquiring wild land, common land, in response to industrialisation. The genius that they had was the mechanism designed by Robert Hunter and written into an Act of Parliament of inalienability. That means if we declare something to be inalienable, we can never sell it. We cannot reverse inalienability. So it's safe forever. Parliament can wrest it from us, but that's an arduous and tedious process, so they rarely try. During our first 40 years, most of the focus of the Trust was on buying or being given wild land. Wicken Fen, Blakeney Point, Brandalow. Beatrix Potter was a huge benefactor, giving us 4,000 acres. A few buildings came our way too, typically very ancient, very dilapidated, and with no contents. The land was the thing, and access for ordinary people was the aim, and that formed our culture. In the 1930s, the great country houses came under threat because of high death duties and taxes. The owner of this one, Philip Lothian, Lord Lothian of Blickling Hall in Norfolk, realised that if the houses could be given to the Trust in lieu of tax and made inalienable, then they would be safe from demolition or development forever. In due course, Parliament agreed and the country house scheme was created. As a result, these very grand houses, often together with their collections, and sometimes even with the families still there, came across to the Trust. Most came via the government in lieu of tax, but some, including many more modest houses, such as Newton's birthplace on the bottom left, were outright gifts to us for the nation. Some of them, like Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall, built in the 16th century, are very challenging from an energy conservation point of view. Bess of Hardwick did not use double glazing. Many came to us in a shaky state, as are these chimneys at the Vine in Basingstoke a few years ago, until we straightened them. The grander houses usually came with their gardens, glorious in many cases, and their parkland, and their deer parks, and of course their farmland. Over 100,000 hectares came to us during that time of the country houses coming into us. And at the time, the Trust had not a lot of staff or money or farming expertise. So we leased a lot of the farmland that came to us to tenant farmers, often on multi-generational leases. As you see here on this slide, we now have 260,000 acres, half of it leased out. The grand houses also came with lots of farmhouses and cottages, in some cases entire villages such as Laycock and West Wickham. And that forms our let estate today of 5,000 cottages that are residential lets and about 500 holiday cottages or homes. In many cases, for reasons I won't explain here, they came with large endowments, either of land that we could sell or of cash. And that's what created the endowment, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, by the 1960s, we were on to chapter 3. Just go back a moment, Julene. The huge run of house acquisition was over, but we launched Project Neptune to buy up coastline and protect it from development. And then the next slide shows the huge growth in land that came alongside that, as well as the growth in membership that started then. And finally, in the 1990s, we started to make the houses far more accessible to people, and membership took off. Today, we have 5.7 million members. We're a conservation charity, first and foremost, true to our founders, determined to keep all that wild land accessible and beautiful forever for everyone, and to promote its preservation. Resulting from our second chapter, we're equally determined to conserve these important houses and their contents to high curatorial standards. We've many dozens of expert curators and conservation experts and gardeners and rangers amongst our thousands of staff and tens of thousands of volunteers. We have a huge membership base which funds it alongside the large visitor business. We're a landlord to our let estate and to our tenant farmers. We manage the endowment for net gain. You can see more in our annual report if you're interested, remembering, of course, that our inalienable assets are not on our balance sheet. We take things that have value and make them worthless, as someone said, or, of course, in fact, we make them priceless because they can never be sold. And our aim remains to preserve them for everyone forever. So the carbon chart that I put up at the beginning, which I think, Julene, you can put up again, probably makes more sense to you now. The tenant farms and the let estate are a big part of our carbon emissions, alongside the investments and the goods and services bought in. A charity has fewer constraints in some ways than a company. Its supporters may donate more money if it has higher ambitions to decarbonise, for example. And a charity with a lot of land also has more options to sequester carbon. So we're not presenting a blueprint today, just hoping to tell you a story of a complicated conservation organisation which is trying to raise its game and which has encountered some tricky issues along the way. That generates interesting experiences, and it may help you think about how to change minds or engage colleagues in the boardroom. So we'll switch the slides off, and I'm now going to turn to the Finance Director of the National Trust, Peter Vermeulen. Peter, welcome to the screen, and a great pleasure to engage with you on this subject. Peter, the Investment Committee manages the endowment, and the endowment of the National Trust is now 1.5 billion. We got out of fossil fuels in 2019, or decided to. Why were we so anxious to do that?
Thank you, Orna, and good afternoon, everyone. We were so anxious because climate change is a really big deal for us at the National Trust. Climate change is the biggest risk to the natural and the cultural heritage we look after as a charity. And we spend significant funds battling the effects that we're seeing of climate change today already. rectifying the damage from more frequent storms, managing eroding coast from rising sea levels, and addressing the impact of changing weather patterns on buildings as well as our collections. So for those reasons, we're outspoken about the need to address this. We even took a public position to oppose fracking on our land. So to have a long-term investment strategy that supports fossil fuel extraction companies is simply misaligned with the organization's purpose. And it isn't just a technical misalignment, it went against the values of our staff and it went against the values of our supporters as well, Orna.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And how did you, when we came to making that decision, we made the decision on you mentioned the fracking decision. That was made outside the investment committee. Within the investment committee, there was a debate about getting out of fossil fuels, and that debate came to a head in 2019. Can you remember the dynamics of that? What was interesting about that?
I could definitely remember the dynamics. It's one of those dates that sort of etched in my memory, as it were, and definitely ranks as one of the harder meetings in my career. The thing I vividly remember from that meeting actually was that the only two people who strongly felt about divesting was yourself and myself in that meeting. And actually, everybody else was opposed to divesting from fossil fuels, from fossil fuel extraction companies. Now, reflecting back at that, I think at the heart of the objection lay the perception that we take a lot of risk by enacting a divestment policy to address something that was highly uncertain, climate change. Now, it's a proven fact that as human beings, we prefer working with risk rather than with uncertainty. And allow me to unpack that a little bit for the listeners on this call. The risks that were perceived by the investment committee were the risk of diminished investment returns in the short run, which are important for us as an organization. The risk of the missed opportunity of being invested in those companies that would transition to a clean energy future, that claimed that divestment would drive shares into the hands of less responsible investors, or simply the risk we'd be putting a lot of effort into something that wouldn't actually make a difference. Climate change, on the other hand, was described as an uncertainty. We're unsure how it will impact us. We're unsure what will happen when, and we're unsure whether our actions alone will even make a difference. So it's definitely a meeting where passions ran high.
Yes, indeed. I remember that quite vividly. But one of the issues, as you say, you said everyone except you and I didn't want to divest. I think one or two people were neutral and some people were passionate about it. But I remember two different things about that meeting as well. There were people in the room who really had been quite skeptical about climate change in recent years, or very lukewarm about it, so didn't see that as a risk. And I think that was a barrier to their thinking. And then, of course, the other thing is in it for us was this conflict of interest you have. If you're invested in something, you want the shares to do well. And yet, in the case of the fossil fuels, you want to get out of fossil fuels. And that created a dynamic that was an interesting one to play out. But I think also it was easy for us because fossil fuels weren't that large a part of our portfolio, of course. And we were coming under pressure from our staff and some of our supporters as well, weren't we?
That's right. But one of the things that ultimately was really important in our decision-making process was sort of our perspective as a long-term investor. You said it in your presentation, Orna, which is we exist forever. Our mission is to look after these assets forever. So our investment strategy is a forever strategy. Now, forever is a concept you can't work with. It's a bit like infinity. How do you put that into a calculator? So we translate it typically as sort of a 50-year window. And when you view your investments through a 50-year lens, you start thinking about actually, well, how do we shift towards the world as it will look like in 50 years' time, as it were? And that really sees you becoming motivated to move out of technologies and industries that are very soon going to be industries of the past.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think that 50-year window did help us a lot. I think also there was sometimes an organization needs to send a signal, and sometimes society needs to send a signal that they want things to change. And that was part of the thinking as well. It helped that fossil fuels were not a large part of our portfolio by then, of course. I suspect the debate would have been even more intense if they had been 20% of our portfolio, for example.
No doubt it would have been harder if it had an even bigger financial impact, as it were. But I don't think it would have lessened your passion or my passion for this. And I think our passion came from the fact that for both of us, this wasn't an uncertainty. For both of us, our management style is one of walking the floor. We're not just sitting in a boardroom, as it were. And you and I had been on walks with our rangers that talked about, the shifting shores, the changing bird migration patterns. We'd had tea with curators who talked to us about how caring for these historic collections was getting harder and harder as the climate conditions are changing, or how the gardens are impacted by the increase in pests and diseases that are coming over, and the challenge that gives to our gardeners. So for us, it wasn't an uncertainty. It's really happening on the ground right now, as it were. So I don't think our passion would have lessened in any way.
No, I think that's probably true. And in fact, for every year that I was a trustee, we talked in our annual report about exceptional weather, whether that was drought or floods or storms causing exceptional costs on our properties. So it has been very much a P&L issue for us, the climate change. So the decision on fossil fuels was made, and it struck me actually shortly after that decision had been made that one of the people who had been somewhat sceptical about climate change had begun to change his view, because for a similar reason to us, he was very passionate about trees and had gone to a seminar about growing trees. And in that seminar, he'd been advised that in Britain, we need to start growing very different species of trees than what we used to grow if we want them to survive and thrive in the next 50 to 100 years. And because he loves trees so much, that had made him care very much more about climate change. For me, it was a real example of how you act on what you care about. And if something like climate change is something very distant from you, it's very hard to take it seriously and start to take action on it.
I was just going to re-emphasize that point. Actually, you're entirely right, and we need to really see what that looks like, and why it matters to us, as it were. So for this individual, it was that seminar he went on to, and that's why it's so important to get out there. Is what I would argue and what I would share sort of with Chapter Zero participants today, as it were. The effect of climate change, you can read about it in a boardroom, you can read about it in research and all of that, but actually when you see it firsthand, either in the things that you care about, whatever that passion of yourself is, or if you see it actually in the resources that your organization needs in order to thrive, then actually you have to act, as it were. Now for us, it is easier as a charity because we are directly connected to the natural world and those resources. It feeds our business model, as it were. But I would argue every business is ultimately reliant on the natural world, and somewhere down in your supply chain, you're using those natural resources. And how are you, as participants on this call, connected to how those natural resources are being depleted, or how that is managed sustainably, as it were?
Yeah, indeed, well put. Now, having decided to get out of fossil fuels in 2019, we didn't stop there, did we?
No, we didn't. As hard as that was, actually, that was the easiest part in the journey. That was effectively addressing where our investments weren't aligned with the values and the purpose of the organization. But the big job then only began, which is how do you then align it well? And we started by hiring expertise through an investment advisor called Cambridge Associates, and started by trying to understand what's the carbon footprint of our portfolio and how do we go about creating strategies for positive change in that space. We had a slight start because we already had a relationship with Cambridge Associates. We'd started thinking about launching a venture capital private equity fund looking specifically at commercial startups that also had positive environmental benefits. In short, yeah, so it's effectively green startups, as it were. 5 years ago, that was a theory on a slide. Today, 40% of our investments are in those green startups, as it were. So it's really taken off, as it were. But the other really important step we took on the committee was to really upskill everybody on that committee in the topic of climate change. For existing committee members, it meant actually bringing them out to our places and letting them experience what you and I have experienced sort of as trustee and as executive member on the ground, as it were. And indeed, I remember Lizzie, Carlyle, who's on the call as well, who'll talk in a moment, actually taking us to Durham Park and helping everybody understand how is climate change actually impacting our business model directly, as it were. But it also meant that we were hiring new members. We became insistent on hiring people with deep knowledge of climate change and the impact on investments. And one of those people that we welcomed to our board was Alice, who brought a wealth of expertise to the boardroom table.
Indeed, Peter. Well, I might now bring in Alice to talk about that. As you say, we set in motion some steps to reduce the carbon emissions of our endowment fairly drastically. And I'd love to get Alice's views on how that has worked out so far. Alice, welcome. You joined us. You joined the investment committee 2 years ago.
I did just over, and very nice to be here. Going through your slides and your presentation, Orna, reminded me of how excited I was, and I still am, absolutely, about working for the National Trust, because it's such a national treasure, and being able to contribute to its mission. And with my expertise, it felt like just a wonderful opportunity. So you're absolutely right, and it's nice to hear back on what happened just prior to me joining and the decision to divest. And in fact, I remember one of my interviewing questions was what do you think of our decision to divest from fossil fuels? So it was an extremely exciting time to join, because there was this clear ambition for the National Trust to align its whole operation, which includes the endowment, to the decarbonization effort that overall we had decided to undertake, and our net zero ambition. But then, of course, decarbonizing a financial portfolio is notoriously difficult, because you require that the underlying economy essentially decarbonizes. You invest with financial portfolios such as ours in the stock market, in the corporate debt market, in private equity and private debt. And so we had a substantial challenge ahead of us, especially given our very ambitious net zero target. But we at that stage, it was such a strong commitment from the entire organization and investment committee members to start this process in earnest. So what we then faced the problem of how to do it. How do we decarbonize our endowment, and how do we scale up our climate solutions, our investments in positive climate solutions? So with the help of our new investment advisor, Cambridge, who's been great throughout in helping us, we've decided that it was clear to us that the first thing to do was to ensure that we had a very clear set of beliefs, and we stated those beliefs. What are the principles that should underpin the way that we want to invest. And that clearly included investing with managers, because we don't manage internally any of the assets of the endowment, but we hire portfolio managers. Make sure that our portfolio managers are aligned with our stated beliefs, and make sure that our portfolio managers enable us to do what we wanted to do, which was to decarbonize and investing for positive climate solutions. So equally, decarbonizing the portfolio, which is the first pillar of our activities, is not enough. So the second thing that we had to do was to gradually build a book that invested in these climate solutions, and thirdly, the engagement part.
And we're doing that, if I can just interrupt you, Alice, we're engaging much more than we used to 5 years ago. It's been a transformation that I've seen on that committee. And I think that's one lesson, isn't it? Because we used to say 1.5 billion, and we were only 1.2 billion 5 years ago, I think, isn't enough to have any impact on things. Leave it to the managers. And now we have been much more engaged with our managers about how they are engaging with the investments. I think that's an important change, isn't it?
Absolutely, because the power of the National Trust is that despite the small size of the endowment, certainly compared to other institutional investors, other asset owners, our name and what the National Trust means in not just in the UK, in Europe and beyond. I had an engagement with Japanese companies being very impressed with the National Trust because they visited our properties and they even took up a membership. So for the engagement,
I'm worried that we're going to run out of time. We'll need to switch to Lizzie in a minute, but I wanted to just highlight also something you said about in decarbonising and trying to take that carbon out of the portfolio. We do have debates about how difficult it is, because theory is one thing and practice is another. And for example, if you're invested in a bus company, that is a great asset if it's taking cars off the road, even if its carbon emissions seem high. And if you're investing in a wind turbine manufacturer, it's producing carbon emissions as it makes the turbines, but they're going to take the emissions out of the world once they're whirring around. And so all those debates, they come into the boardroom, don't they, and give us quite a lot of challenge as we try to work our way through them, making sure that our investment is therefore good for overall decarbonisation, rather than inadvertently doing something stupid, as well as reducing our returns.
Yes, absolutely. And these are all sectors, your examples and many others are sectors and underlying companies that, yes, are emitting, but they are part of our overall economic system, and we have to support through engagement the decarbonization of those underlying sectors and economies. And what we do with our engagement, for example, which is both individual but especially collaborative through Climate Action 100+ and IIGCC, and our participation in working groups on both investor practices and individual company engagement is geared to that. We can only decarbonize if we play our part and the whole system decarbonizes.
Thank you so much, Alice. I'm now going to switch away from our investment committee discussion, and I'm going to call in Lizzie Carlyle, our head of environment. Welcome, Lizzie. Thank you very much for joining me. So, Lizzie, you might think it's all very well for the investment committee with its theoretical discussion about how the world works out there, but you're right in the middle of it, and actually literally so. I can see that you are in front of a rather old panelled wall. You're probably in the attic of one of our grander houses, am I right?
Hi, Orna. Yes, you are right. I'm sitting in the attic office of Ham House, our property in Richmond. And actually, it's very fortuitous that I'm here today, because it's reminded me of our climate change summit we had with our executive team back in 2019, where we really kind of had a coming together and a formation of our current climate action strategy. So it's been great to be back at Ham. And the reason we brought our exec team here actually is because it's a great demonstration of how climate change is impacting on our properties. I mean, it's not sitting perilously at the edge of a cliff like some of our places are, but it is really suffering from things like flooding. We're right by the River Thames, obviously, but also less obvious things. So high heat has become a real issue for looking after Ham House, but importantly for looking after our people who look after Ham House. So we've been spending the morning thinking about strategies for our staff and volunteers here at Ham, where the temperatures inside the house can often get above even 40 degrees. So it's really become a very pressing issue. Yeah. That summit meeting that we had in 2019, that was where we kind of brought together, I suppose, all of our experience of climate change and our strategies that go back decades actually to tackle energy and sustainability issues. But it was a great opportunity to form those all together into one strategy, which we're currently operating today, headlined, I suppose, by that net zero by 2030 target, but importantly also addressing how we build resilience to climate change impacts, and also how we use our stretch out into our membership and supporter base to inspire action amongst those supporters.
So we have a plan which is RACE, isn't it? Reduce, adapt, capture, and engage. And
absolutely, yeah. So the reduce bit is well, you showed the picture earlier on of all of our emission categories. So some of those are a real challenge to decarbonise, but we're coming up with plans in order to do that. The adaptation piece is by no means second ranking to decarbonisation. I mean, it is absolutely front and centre in some of our site managers' minds as they deal with the issues. But what we're trying to do is give them the tools to plan forward and access the kind of emerging science around what forward climate change impacts look like. The capture piece is incredibly close to our hearts. I think Peter was talking about our role as stewards of natural resources, but we do have this large land holding. In some ways, it's a blessing and a curse. So at the moment, we can see from our carbon accounting that we have a large chunk of emissions sitting with agriculture and land use, but we know we can switch that around and get real benefits for both removing carbon from the atmosphere, but also for nature and for allowing access for people to enjoy it. And then the E of our race is that engagement piece.
so how do you go about decarbonising something like Hardwick House, which we showed earlier, with all of those windows and all of the challenges in it? The historic buildings in general, how do we approach that?
So, Orna, I mean, that is a real challenge. I think the work that we've done in building our carbon account has been incredibly useful in allowing us to know where to focus, where to prioritise our efforts. So we can now look at what somewhere like Hardwick's carbon footprint looks like, and that then starts to help us build that plan. It's probably worth saying that actually the heat and power in Hardwick House will be a really small part of the overall carbon footprint, but it is our direct emissions, our direct responsibility to tackle that. So we definitely put that front and centre. But then we need to look at how we're managing the land that surrounds it, but also the supply chain that comes in and the goods and services that we provide out to our visitors.
Yes, you're reminding me, I was at a function in Hardwick House in 2018, I think it was, in March, when there was a big freeze, and it was about -2 degrees outside, and in Hardwick Hall I think it was -5 degrees. There was nothing being wasted on heating there, that was for sure. But you're right, the big thing for us is that let estate and the goods and services, as well as the tenanted properties. Goods and services, Lizzie, how has that evolved? How have you gone about creating the plans for reducing the carbon emissions from those?
I think it's fair to say we're still in formation of some of that planning. It's we've got something like 20,000 suppliers into the National Trust, so it's a real complex piece to try and put our arms around that and come up with one plan. We've broken it down actually into business areas, so we know, for example, that our construction work, our kind of built conservation work, those all come with a high carbon price tag. So we at least know now where to start, where to really put that focus. But that will be some of it will be about recontracting, and some of it is just about making sure that all of our staff that are involved in procurement really understand what role they can play in choosing whether to procure at all, and then to make really good procurement decisions.
Yes, indeed. And what do you see as the most difficult challenges? What are the pitfalls? You've got all this analysis, which has enabled us to measure our carbon emissions very accurately. Does it get in the way sometimes?
So I think I wouldn't claim to say that we've measured all our carbon emissions accurately. Actually, some of them are really, really difficult to put a figure on. And I think that can become a challenge if you become completely data driven. I think on the other hand, within our staff and volunteer resource, we've got some really fantastic minds and local knowledge, and those are the people who can really come up with some of the solutions that we need for climate change. So it's marrying up those two things about making a fulsome carbon account that gives us enough confidence that we know where to prioritize our efforts and to be able to track and say we're definitely moving in the right direction, but also to leave enough space for those kind of local innovations and decisions that are really going to be key to helping us get out of this.
Yes. Now, you mentioned earlier that land is a blessing and a curse, because obviously land poorly managed is emitting carbon and land well managed can sequester it. We have big plans there, don't we, for peatland and for tree planting?
We do, yes. I mean, we've had a long-term plan about creating and restoring more habitats, more nature on our land, and allowing people access to that. But the climate change challenge actually has really ramped up our ambitions around land. So with once we understood how much carbon we were emitting, and therefore, in order to get to net zero, how much we needed to balance out from removals from the atmosphere, that really sped up our ambition around tree planting. So we've now got a commitment to establish 20 million trees. Some of those will come from planting, some of that will come from just allowing woodlands to regenerate. And we also know that our peatlands, many of which have been historically in poor state, and that means they're emitting carbon into the atmosphere. We can now use the power of our climate strategy to make sure that we really focus on getting those peatlands back into good condition. And all these things are fantastic because they're also delivering for the sort of joint crisis, which is the nature one. So we're making sure that we're hitting the two things at the same time as we go.
Yes, of course. Re-wetting those peatlands and bringing them to life changes the biodiversity on them for the better, as well as making those peatlands net absorbers of carbon rather than emitters, for example.
Indeed. So it's really important for natural habitats. It's actually really rich cultural environments as well. So many of our peatlands are great environments to preserve archaeological remains. So that's important. But I think everybody loves a bit of bog. I hope they do on the call. They're just part of our landscape, and we should be cherishing them like that.
Yeah, indeed. Good. Well, thank you very much, Lizzie. I'm going to turn to see questions. We've got a couple of questions here. One was, we have a large and complex carbon footprint, and we're also investing in renewables. What are we doing to improve energy conservation in our houses and to improve carbon sequestration on the land? We've just talked a bit about carbon sequestration, Lizzie, explicitly on the peatlands, and of course the tree planting will sequester a lot of carbon as well. Energy conservation in the houses, leaving aside Hardwick Hall and the challenges of the very grand houses where double glazing might be a bit tricky. We do have the Let estate, and there are plans to upgrade those cottages, aren't there?
Yep, there are. I mean, I think we don't leave aside the mansions and castles. Actually, we've been working over the last 20 years anyway to try and make them as efficient as they can be, but without losing any of their heritage values. So we've done some really good work. We were talking earlier today about Durham Park, where we had to re-roof the mansion at Durham, just outside Bath. We had to do that for conservation purposes because the roof was reaching the end of its life. But in doing so, we added a significant amount of insulation, raised the roof a little bit, which got our curators excited, but actually we've ended up with a really good outcome, and we've saved around 35% of the energy use at Durham because of that intervention, and then the subsequent management by the team there. So we can do stuff with our historic buildings, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. We just have to make sure that we don't erode that heritage value. I mean, the letter state is really interesting because everybody will be experiencing the shocking energy price rise, but our tenants are certainly not immune to that. So we've got a real responsibility, I think, to make sure that our houses that we provide people to live in are fit for purpose and affordable to heat, as well as to contribute to that decarbonisation agenda. So we have to find a way through renewable energy and through energy efficiency that allow people to continue to live in those places.
Yes, indeed, indeed. So I've got a couple of other questions here. I had one on did the skeptics on the investment committee begin to understand and now believe in climate change? I think there are an awful lot of people who 5 years ago just didn't think much about climate change, and it's amazing how many there were 5 years ago and how they began to change in the past 5 years. So rather than skeptics, they were probably more in the camp of not thinking about it very much. And I think it's true to say that most people now think about climate change a lot more than they did, including the people who were on the committee at the time. I have another question here, which is a trickier one, I think. How do you balance the potential losses from not investing in fossil fuels against Charity Commission requirements as a charity to maximise income from money donated? And of course, in fact, when we came out of fossil fuels at the right time and probably made money since on that, which highlights the challenge of predicting the future in any set of investments. But I don't know, Peter, if you have anything else to add to that commentary.
Yeah, I'd say two things to that. The first is that the Charity Commission does want you to take a holistic approach and not just maximize one aspect of the organization. Really think about it. What's the impact across the entirety of the organization? And you mustn't do something in one part of the organization that maximizes a benefit that harms the remainder of the organization. So it's entirely valid to think holistically about these things. The second thing is to come back to our investment horizon. We are thinking in 50-year terms. And if you think through that lens, then why are we backing fossil fuel extraction companies which are declining, and why are we not extracting our funds out of those and actually pump charging the industries which will thrive in 50 years' time? And that's exactly what we have done. So we still think it's, as much as it's the right thing to do as a charity, we also think it's a really sound investment decision as a long-term investor.
Thank you, Peter. So the next question I see here, also on the investment committee, where do you draw the line on fossil fuels? Is it just extraction, or would you also exclude downstream activities like, for example, Tesco, who derive a proportion of their profits from forecourt fuel sales? Alice, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, it's a tricky one. So where we draw the line is in extraction and reserves. And so any kind of fossil fuel reserves are excluded. As far as downstream activities are concerned, then it kind of becomes more nuanced, and they are, and we've made a decision to subject those to engagement, either directly through our activities or through our invested managers. But it's the concept of downstream and the whole of the Scope 3 emissions tackling is fairly complicated, and in order not to have to exclude too many sectors. We've decided that to stick to the principle of owning and extracting.
It's interesting, Alice, isn't it? Because one of the points about divesting from fossil fuels, and again, I think it was easier for us because they weren't a big portion of our portfolio at the time. But one of the very strong arguments not to divest is you will drive such companies into the hands of private equity and therefore offline. And I think you felt that strongly, for example, and it's a very valid, it was the main reason not to invest. That as a responsible investor, you have control over the fossil fuel companies, you can help steer them towards the right path, versus if you sell them, they will just end up in the dark market with perhaps less transparency, and you don't know what's going on. And of course, the complication or the argument against that is that investment companies cannot manage for everything. So I think BP, for example, has just announced that it's going to divest its coal, and that could end up in private equity. So BP is doing all sorts of excellent things because responsible investors have put pressure on it, but it's now divesting to somewhere where there might not be control and transparency of the quality that BP would have brought to that. So it's where actually you need carbon taxes, you need government, you need policy as well. Investors can't do everything themselves. Money is powerful, but it's not the whole solution here. And we can't square the circle in all our decisions. Sometimes you do something to send a signal as much as for everything else.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And essentially what we're doing, especially in Europe, we are leading as investors the policy debate. And it's you can see that not just in our country, but in Europe as well, policy is kind of tentatively catching up, but it's still insufficient, because if there were carbon taxes, then we would have a proper level playing field, and companies would have also the confidence to decarbonize. And it's true that we like to engage because we like to help companies to decarbonize, but ultimately, when the pressure becomes really quite high, then the decision to divest, like BP is taken, and many other companies, and to just sell off these assets to private markets can ensure. And that is the reason why, as investors, we have started defining our priorities and our methods of engagement with private equity funds. And so there is quite a lot of activity going on the investor side to try and get private equity funds and private debt funds to step up their game and don't become just the high emitting companies' way to rapidly decarbonize by selling off the assets.
Yes, indeed. So all of the questions are around investment, I think, here. The next one, if you have government bonds and other LDI instruments in your endowment fund, how do you think about the carbon impact of those? And how have you been able to get carbon data on those investments? Again, I think one for you briefly, Alice.
Yeah, it's so this is work in progress. It's absolutely right. We do have government bond exposure for our cash management purposes. They tend to be shorter term instruments, but absolutely, and that is an issue. We're part of collaborative initiatives on how to define the carbon emissions of sovereign debt, because that is of course quite a complicated thing to do, because you essentially have to take into account what are the overall carbon emissions of the entire country, and but then you have companies, and how do you allocate companies, for example, are multinationals and they have operations in more than one country. So there hasn't yet been a final answer. So there are a couple of efforts, collaborative efforts going on how to account for this, and we will of course adopt best standards once they become available. But there is no answer yet, final answer.
Good. Okay, so then we have another one here. It sounds like the NT approach was driven largely by mission values alignment, but that climate action can't come at any cost. How did you decide on what the right level of expenditure was? Peter, did you want to answer that? Of course, the right level of lost income when you are looking at the future is always a difficult one to measure.
It is hard, yes, and it is indeed easier for organizations like National Trust to get started on that journey. But I would say actually everything that we have done has proven to be financially incredibly sound. So take, for example, our initiative to generate 50% of our energy from renewables on our own land. We have achieved that, and at this point in time is an immensely helpful financial hedge against the energy prices, which we know are going to be more volatile, as it were. Similarly, 2 years ago, when we invested in nuclear fusion, it felt a little bit like a long shot, but it was only last week when the BBC announced that in Oxford, actually, they've had a real breakthrough and the commercialization of nuclear fusion is becoming a reality. So being slightly ahead of the curve does mean that you're investing and you're taking decisions with a level of some uncertainty. And comes back to my point, which is don't be scared about that uncertainty all the time, as it were, because the flip side of the argument is if you're the wrong side of the curve, there'll be a really hefty price to pay.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Peter. Though fusion is not something I'd necessarily regard as completely commercial yet. I think it's been 20 years away since I was about 5 years old, and is still 20 years away, possibly. Now, we've got a couple of long questions here from Benedict Gemel. The National Trust has a plan to be net zero by 2030. With so much land, trees, etc., this should be easy. More interestingly, when will the National Trust become carbon negative, when only balancing operational carbon emissions with carbon saving through renewables? I think, again, Peter, you had some comments on that.
Yeah, it was sort of briefly to highlight that it isn't as straightforward as it may sound. If you simply had unused land lying around, of course, tree planting is straightforward. But as you pointed out, Orna, in your presentation, actually, a lot of our land is farmed on long-term leases. So it's about taking those communities along on that journey, and that has real impact on local communities, their livelihoods, etc. So changing land use is a really big challenge for the nation, and it is for us as well as an organization. And in addition to that, of course, we've got the let estate and the houses, which got a very high carbon footprint as a result of the age of those properties, as it were. But yes, we do have an ambition to be carbon negative. If we get to carbon neutrality by 2030, 20 years ahead of when the world wants to achieve that, then soon after that, we will start becoming carbon negative, and to a fairly large degree, actually.
I think it's also worth remembering, isn't it, that part of our reason to set a target for 2030 is if you set a target for 2050, you don't really have to do anything immediately. And the current leadership of a company doesn't have to do anything really immediately. You have to set a pretty aggressive target for 2030 to get short-term action. And in our case, our target is very aggressive, and of course we may not meet it, but it is what galvanized the organization. And of course, we're going to continue beyond 2030. It's not as if on getting there or on nearly getting there, we would stop and say, job done. The point would be to try and absorb as much carbon as possible. We would love to be so-called carbon positive and to remove as much carbon from the world as we possibly could for the foreseeable future. I think that is all the questions that I could see. Am I missing anything? I
think you have touched on the ones that are under one tab. There's also the open questions, which us as participants haven't had a chance yet to get to and type answers to.
So which ones have I missed here? Some of us participants may be able to see. I think we have. And then, okay. Am I missing people? No, I can't see. I've got a raised hand here. Vicky Pope. I can allow Vicky to talk if it's a question. Has Vicky's hand disappeared?
I think Vicky also posted a question, and that was, is the National Trust participating in research to find ways to use land that benefit food production, ecosystems, and reduce carbon emissions?
Excellent, excellent. Because yes.
Perhaps
Vicky, that was your
hoping...
question, was it?
That was my question, yes.
Okay, it's not showing up on my screen.
It's not an easy question to answer, I know.
So I'm not even seeing it on my screen. Peter, would you like to start trying to answer it?
Can I defer to Lizzie?
Yeah, do, Peter. I mean, I think, as I say, a lot of this isn't new in our thinking, actually, and we've been trying to establish ways where we can work with our tenant farmers, as Peter has said, to really to help them to deliver our objectives. So we've had objectives, particularly around nature, for a very long time, as Orna set out in her opening presentation. And we've recognised that we really need our tenant farmers to work with us to help deliver those objectives. The carbon one, for sure, has come more latterly, and I think you know, that pressure is coming not just from us as landlord, but also through farmers' own supply chains. Certainly, the supermarkets are all very interested in their own net zero goals as well. So there's a lot of pressure on our tenant farmers to deliver against the two agendas of nature and climate. And I think we are trying to work with them to help them understand what methodologies might be best. Indeed, we do have two in-hand farms, one in North Wales and one in East Anglia. And if I take Wimpole in Cambridgeshire as an example, which is our in-hand farm, I mean, we've been demonstrating ways of growing arable crops, which do that bit around delivering for nature and climate, and we've been using that as a host farm for neighbouring farmers and wider farming groups, as well as sort of getting political interests along to see that work on the ground as well.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. I think we're out of time. I make it 13:58 and my notes say that it is important for us to end promptly. So there are a few unanswered questions there. We can answer them afterwards for those who would like, but I'm going to draw it to a close now. So thank you very much indeed for coming to listen to us. Thank you to Peter, to Alice and to Lizzie, and thank you for all the questions that you sent in.
Thank you, Orna.
Thank you, Orna.
Thank you.
Bye.